The air inside the war room at Camp Ironhold was thick enough to choke a man, smelling of stale filtered coffee, burning electronics, and the terrified sweat of junior officers. At the center of the room, a massive digital tactical map glowed with an angry red light, illuminating the faces of the men who decided who lived and who died. In the corner, invisible to everyone who mattered, Elias Thorne dipped his gray, stringy mop into a yellow bucket of murky water. He was 50 years old, with a slight limp in his left leg and a back that curved forward as if he were permanently bowing in apology for his own existence. His gray jumpsuit was 2 sizes too big, swallowing a frame that looked frail to the untrained eye. He moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic slowness, dragging the wet cotton strands across the pristine white tiles. To the men in this room, Elias was not a human being. He was furniture, a necessary inconvenience that kept the dust away while they planned the destruction of enemy compounds. He kept his eyes on the floor, watching the reflection of Colonel Vance Sterling pacing back and forth. Sterling was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, almost as much as he loved the mirror-polished shine of his custom leather boots. He was shouting at a terrified lieutenant, his finger jabbing the air, completely unaware that the man mopping the floor behind him had once forgotten more about warfare than Sterling would ever learn. "I don't care about the satellite delay, Lieutenant. I want boots on the ground in Sector 4 by 0800 hours." Sterling's voice boomed off the soundproof walls, causing the other officers to flinch in unison. Elias paused his mopping for a fraction of a second. Sector 4. The name triggered a violent cold spike of adrenaline in his chest. He knew Sector 4. He knew the jagged ridges of the Arghandab Valley, the way the shadows played tricks on your eyes at dawn, and the way the silence there was heavier than anywhere else on Earth because it was always waiting to be broken by gunfire. Elias squeezed the mop handle, his knuckles turning white. He shouldn't be listening. He was just the janitor. He was the guy who cleaned the toilets and emptied the shredders. But the tactical map on the screen was wrong. They were sending 20 young Marines into a bottleneck that looked safe from the sky, but was a death trap from the ground. Elias had lost friends in that exact ravine 20 years ago. He took a breath, the smell of bleach filling his nose, and made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had cultivated over the last decade of hiding. He took a step forward, the wet mop swinging slightly, and accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, let the dirty, soapy water slosh over the toe of Colonel Sterling's immaculate boot. The silence that followed was immediate and terrifying. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a predator realizing it has been touched by prey. Colonel Sterling stopped mid-sentence. He looked down at his boot, where a dark gray puddle was slowly soaking into the expensive leather. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head to look at Elias. The colonel's face was a mask of incredulous rage. He didn't just see a mistake, he saw an insult to his rank, his station, and his very existence. "You!" Sterling hissed, the word dripping with venom. "You clumsy, incompetent waste of oxygen." The entire room froze. The lieutenant looked relieved to be out of the line of fire, while the other officers stared at their tablets, terrified to make eye contact. Sterling stepped closer to Elias, invading his personal space, looming over him like a tower of khaki and arrogance. "Do you have any idea how much these boots cost? They cost more than you make in a year, janitor. Look at you." Sterling gestured vaguely at Elias's stained jumpsuit and his graying, unkempt hair. "You're a mess. A walking disaster. How did you even get clearance to be in this building?" Elias didn't flinch. He didn't back away. He just gripped the mop handle tighter, his eyes fixed on the colonel's collarbone, refusing to meet his gaze. "Apologies, sir," Elias said, his voice rough and quiet, like gravel grinding together. "I was just trying to clean the—" Sterling cut him off with a harsh, barking laugh. "Clean? You? You look like you haven't showered in a week. You're a stain on this base, do you know that?" The colonel turned to the room, seeking an audience for his cruelty. "Look at him, gentlemen." This is what happens when you have zero ambition. This is what failure looks like in human form. A janitor, mopping up after his betters. Sterling turned back to Elias, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He reached out and flicked the collar of Elias's jumpsuit with a disdainful finger. What did you do before this, huh? Wash dishes? Dig ditches? You certainly weren't doing anything that required a brain. Elias swallowed the rage rising in his throat. He wanted to tell him. He wanted to say, before this, I was hunting men like you for sport. But he couldn't. He had made a promise to his daughter. He had promised to stay invisible, to stay safe. But then, Sterling made a mistake. He turned back to the map and pointed at the ravine in Sector 4. "We pushed the convoy through here," Sterling announced confidently. "Fast and hard." Elias couldn't stop himself. The lives of 20 kids were on that screen. "It's a kill box, sir," Elias said. The words were soft, but they carried across the room like a gunshot. Sterling whipped around, his eyes wide with shock. "Excuse me?" Elias looked up, finally meeting the colonel's eyes. His gaze was not the gaze of a janitor. It was cold, flat, and dangerous. "That ravine, the topography creates a blind spot on the thermal scans. If you send the convoy in there, they'll be hit from the ridges on both sides. You need to flank from the east." For a second, the room was paralyzed. The strategy made perfect sense. The lieutenant looked at the map, realizing the janitor was right. But Sterling's ego was too fragile to handle correction from a man holding a mop. His face turned a deep, violent shade of red. He stepped forward and shoved Elias hard in the chest. The force of the shove caught Elias off guard. He stumbled back, and his jumpsuit snagged on the sharp metal edge of a filing cabinet. "Right." The sound of tearing fabric was loud in the quiet room. The cheap gray cotton of Elias's sleeve tore open from the shoulder down to the elbow. Elias regained his balance, breathing heavily, his arm exposed to the cold air of the war room. He tried to cover it, to pull the fabric back together, but it was too late. Sterling opened his mouth to scream another insult, to fire him, to have him thrown off the base, but the words died in his throat. The colonel's eyes were locked on Elias's upper arm. There, revealed by the torn fabric, was not the pale, soft skin of a man who scrubbed floors. It was a road map of scars, burn marks, and thick, corded muscle. And in the center of the scarred flesh, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo in black ink. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was a golden trident, clutching a pistol and a cutlass, anchored by an eagle. The insignia of the Navy SEALs. But below it was something even rarer, a small, jagged skull with a dagger through the eye, the specific unit marking of SEAL Team 6's Ghost Squadron. The room went deathly silent. Sterling took a step back, his face draining of color, his eyes darting from the tattoo to the janitor's face, realizing for the first time that he wasn't looking at a servant. He was looking at a predator who had just allowed him to live. The silence in the war room stretched so tight it felt like a piano wire wrapped around everyone's throat, vibrating with a tension that threatened to snap and draw blood. Colonel Sterling stared at the jagged skull tattoo on Elias's arm, his brain struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before him. In Sterling's world, hierarchy was absolute. Janitors were failures, and officers were gods, and there was no universe where the two overlapped. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful for him, manifesting as a vein throbbing violently in his temple. He blinked rapidly, desperate to find a logical explanation that didn't shatter his ego. It had to be a lie. It had to be a trick. The initial shock on Sterling's face curdled into something uglier, a smug, self-righteous disbelief. He let out a breathy, incredulous scoff that echoed in the silent room. "Stolen valor," he whispered, the words hissing through his teeth like steam escaping a pressure valve. He looked around at his subordinates, seeking validation for his theory. "That's it, isn't it? You're not just a janitor. You're a fraud. You're a pathetic little man walking around with ink you didn't earn, playing pretend while real men do the work." The accusation hung heavy in the air, a charge even more serious than incompetence. To wear the trident without earning it was a mortal sin in this building, and Sterling knew he had just found the weapon he needed to destroy Elias completely. Elias slowly pulled the torn fabric of his jumpsuit back over his shoulder, covering the ink, but the image was already burned into the retinas of every man in the room. He didn't respond to the colonel's taunt with anger. Instead, a profound, weary sadness settled in his eyes. He had expected this. He had known that the moment he stepped out of the shadows, the world would try to drag him back down. "I didn't ask you to believe me, Colonel," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling with the quiet confidence of a man who has stared death in the face and made it blink. "I asked you to check the ravine." He nodded toward the tactical map, where the blue icons representing the convoy were inching closer to the red zone of Sector 4. "If I'm a liar, arrest me. Throw me in the brig. I don't care. But if you don't divert that convoy in the next 2 minutes, those boys are going to burn, and that smoke will be on your soul, not mine." Elias stood his ground, his posture shifting unconsciously from the slumped shoulders of a laborer to the rigid, balanced stance of a combat operator. He wasn't mopping the floor anymore. He was holding the room hostage with nothing but the truth. Sterling's face turned a dangerous shade of purple, his humiliation transforming into blind, white-hot rage. He couldn't let a janitor give tactical orders in his war room, regardless of the tattoo. It was a challenge to his authority that could not stand. "You dare lecture me on command?" Sterling roared, stepping forward and shoving his face inches from Elias's nose. "I am a colonel in the United States Army. You are a civilian contractor who cleans toilets. I should have you court-martialed for impersonating an officer." He turned sharply to the 2 military police officers guarding the heavy steel doors. "MPs, get in here! Secure this man immediately!" The doors swung open, and the heavy boots of the police thundered across the tile floor. They hesitated for a fraction of a second when they saw who they were arresting. Old Eli, the guy who always gave them extra coffee in the mornings. But an order was an order. They grabbed Elias's arms, twisting them behind his back. The metal cuffs clicked shut with a harsh, final sound. "Get him out of my sight," Sterling spat, adjusting his uniform as if contact with Elias had contaminated him. "Throw him in the holding cell. I'll deal with this trash after the mission." As the MPs dragged Elias toward the door, the room suddenly erupted in a cacophony of digital alarms. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was piercing, cutting through the colonel's arrogance like a knife. Everyone froze. All eyes snapped to the massive screen. The blue icons of the convoy had entered the ravine in Sector 4. Suddenly, the icons began to flash red. "Contact!" the communications officer screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "We have contact! RPG fire from the ridges! Lead vehicle is disabled! They're taking heavy fire from both sides!" The room descended into instant chaos. Officers were shouting into headsets, typing furiously, trying to coordinate air support that was too far away. Sterling stood paralyzed in the center of the storm, his mouth hanging open, his face pale. The scenario was playing out exactly as the janitor had predicted, down to the second. The blind spot, the ambush, the bottleneck. On the screen, the thermal feed showed the ghostly white shapes of enemy fighters swarming down from the cliffs, trapping the convoy in a kill box. The brilliance of Sterling's plan was dissolving into a massacre, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elias stopped in the doorway, resisting the pull of the MPs. He didn't look back with triumph. There was no "I told you so" in his expression, only the haunted look of a man watching a nightmare repeat itself. He could hear the screams of the young soldiers over the open comms channel, the chaotic chatter of machine gun fire, the desperate calls for a medic. It sounded exactly like the day he had lost his own team in the Paktia province 10 years ago. The sounds triggered a phantom pain in his leg and a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He looked at Colonel Sterling, who was now gripping the edge of the tactical table, his knuckles white, watching his career and his men burn. "It's not too late to call in the AC-130 loitering in Sector 2, Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise one last time. It's off mission, but it has the fuel. Override the protocol, Colonel. Save them. Then the MPs shoved him forward, and the heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing Elias in the hallway. He was in handcuffs, heading to a cell, stripped of his dignity and his freedom. But as he walked down the sterile corridor, Elias felt a strange sense of calm. The mask was off. The janitor was gone. The ghost had returned. The holding cell was a concrete box designed to strip a man of his sense of time, smelling faintly of ammonia and old despair. Elias sat on the narrow metal cot, the handcuffs biting into his wrists, but he barely felt the cold steel against his skin. His mind was miles away, drifting through the fog of a decade-old memory that the chaos in the war room had violently dislodged. The silence here was different from the silence of the cleaning closet. It was heavy and suffocating, the kind of silence that forces you to listen to the ghosts you've spent 10 years trying to outrun. He stared at the gray wall opposite him, but what he saw was the green-tinted grain of night vision goggles and the jagged silhouette of the Hindu Kush Mountains against a starless sky. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Colonel Sterling was fading, replaced by a familiar, aching hollowness in his chest. He hadn't just spoken up because of the tactical error. He had spoken up because the specific coordinates, Sector 4, the Argandab Ravine, were the graveyard of his former life. That was where Sergeant Major Elias Thorne had died, and where Eli the janitor was born from the ashes of a mission that never officially happened. The flashback hit him with the force of a physical blow, transporting him back to a freezing night in November 2013. Operation Red Serpent. It was supposed to be a simple extraction. Get in, grab the high-value target, and get out before the sun crested the peaks. Elias was the team leader of Echo Squad, a ghost unit that operated off the books. They moved like smoke through the valley, 12 of the best operators the Navy had ever forged, but they had been sold out. The intelligence was bad, poisoned from the inside. Elias remembered the sound of the first mortar hitting the ground. It wasn't a bang, but a wet, tearing thud that shook the earth beneath his boots. Then the world exploded. He remembered the screams of men who were like brothers to him, the smell of cordite mixing with the metallic tang of blood, and the voice of his comms officer fading into static. He had dragged 3 of them to the extract point, his own leg shredded by shrapnel, refusing to leave anyone behind. But the chopper never came. Command had called it a loss of asset and burned the perimeter to cover their tracks. Elias was the only one who walked out of that valley alive, carrying the weight of 11 dog tags and a burning hatred for the suits who traded soldiers' lives for political leverage. That was the night the promise was made, not to his country, but to the small, fragile voice waiting for him on the other side of the world. After he was medevaced to Germany, broken and disillusioned, he received the news that his wife had passed away from a sudden aneurysm while he was lying in a hospital bed. His daughter, Sarah, was just 8 years old, left alone in a world that had taken everything from her. When Elias finally made it home, leaning on a cane, Sarah had clung to his leg and begged him through tears, "Daddy, please don't go to the scary place again. Please don't leave me." That plea broke what was left of his warrior spirit. He realized that being a hero for his country meant nothing if he couldn't be a father to his child. So, he buried Elias Thorne. He took the disability pension, which wasn't enough to pay for Sarah's specialized boarding school, and he found a job that required 0 clearance and 0 questions. A janitor. It was perfect. He could disappear in plain sight, working at the very base that orchestrated the wars, ensuring he knew exactly when the world was safe enough for his daughter, while punishing himself with the humility of the mop. For 10 years, the penance had worked. Elias had perfected the art of being invisible. He learned to slump his shoulders to hide the width of his back. He learned to limp more heavily than he needed to. He learned to keep his mouth shut when young lieutenants discussed tactics that would get them killed. He washed their floors, emptied their trash, and listened to them mock him, swallowing his pride like a bitter pill every single morning. He watched men like Colonel Sterling rise through the ranks, Men who cared more about the crease in their trousers than the lives of their platoon. It was a slow, grinding torture, a daily reminder of the powerlessness he had chosen. But it kept Sarah safe. It kept him off the grid. Until today. The moment he saw that convoy heading into the same trap that had claimed his team, the dam broke. The instinct to protect, forged in the fires of Bud S. and tempered in a dozen war zones, overrode the promise of safety. He had exposed himself. The tattoo was seen. The mask was shattered. And now, sitting in this cell, Elias knew that his quiet life was over. The system he had hidden from had found him again. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor pulled Elias back to the present. He expected the heavy tread of the MPs coming to transfer him to the brig, or perhaps the angry, rhythmic stomp of Colonel Sterling coming to gloat. But the footsteps were different. Sharp, precise, the sound of hard heels striking concrete with purpose. Click-clack, click-clack. They stopped right outside his cell door. There was a pause, a whispered exchange with the guard, and then the heavy electronic lock buzzed and disengaged with a metallic clunk. The door swung open. It wasn't the colonel. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the harsh halogen lights of the hallway, was a woman in a sharp, tailored black suit that looked out of place in a military prison. She was holding a thick manila folder, her red hair pulled back in a severe bun, her green eyes sharp and unyielding. Elias felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew that stance. He knew those eyes. It was Evelyn Weaver. 10 years ago, she was the CIA analyst who had been the voice in his ear during Operation Red Serpent, the only one who had tried to send the chopper back. She stepped into the cell, the door closing behind her, and tossed the file onto the cot next to him. "Hello, Ghost," she said softly. "I told them you were dead. It seems I'm a terrible liar." Elias stared at the manila folder lying on the thin gray mattress between them. The stamp Eyes Only, Level 6, was faded, but the red ink still screamed danger. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he looked up at Evelyn, his eyes narrowing in the dim light of the cell. She hadn't aged much in 10 years. She still wore her authority like armor, cold and impenetrable. "I'm retired, Evie," Elias said, his voice raspy. "I scrub floors. I fix leaking pipes. That's who I am now. You have the wrong man." He leaned back against the cold concrete wall, trying to summon the apathy that had been his shield for a decade. But his heart was hammering against his ribs. Evelyn didn't blink. She took a step closer, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply on the stone floor, echoing like a countdown. "We both know that's a lie," she replied, her voice low and urgent. "You didn't hide here because you wanted to disappear, Elias. You hid here because you wanted to stay close to the fight without being in it. You've been watching the intel feeds while you empty the trash. You know the terrain better than the satellites do." She reached down and flipped the folder open. "But this isn't about you anymore. Look at the photo." Elias looked down, despite himself. Clipped to the top of the file was a grainy, high-contrast surveillance photo taken from a high-altitude drone. It showed a gathering of men in a rocky courtyard deep in the mountains. In the center of the group stood a tall, bearded figure with a scarred face, holding a distinctive curved knife. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and numb. He knew that face. It haunted his nightmares every single night for 10 years. It was Malik Al-Zarooni, the butcher, the warlord who had orchestrated the ambush on Echo Squad. The man Elias had allegedly killed before the extraction. "Impossible," Elias whispered, the word catching in his throat like a shard of glass. "I put 2 rounds in his chest. I watched him fall." Evelyn nodded grimly. "We thought so too. But he survived. He's been rebuilding, hidden in the darkest caves of the chaotic borderlands. And he's not just back, Elias. He's the one coordinating the ambush on the convoy right now. He didn't attack those boys by accident. He attacked them to draw out a response. He's hunting for you. The revelation hit Elias like a physical punch. The attack wasn't random warfare. It was a personal vendetta. Elias stood up, the metal cuffs clinking softly. He paced the small length of the cell, his limp more pronounced now that the old wounds in his soul had been reopened. "I can't do this, Evie," he said, his voice cracking with a desperation he rarely showed. "I made a promise to Sarah. She's 18 now. She's graduating in 2 months. I promised her I was done with the gun." He looked at Evelyn, pleading with her to understand. "If I go back out there, I don't come back. I know how this story ends. I'm not the soldier I was. I'm an old man with a bad leg and too many ghosts." Evelyn's expression softened for a fraction of a second, revealing the friend she used to be, before the mask of the handler slammed back into place. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a second photograph. She didn't say a word. She just held it up. It wasn't a tactical map. It was a picture of a girl with bright eyes and curly hair, walking out of a library in Virginia. It was Sarah. But in the background of the photo, circled in red marker, was a man watching her from a parked sedan. A man with a tattoo on his neck that matched the insignia of Al-Zarooni's militia. The air left the room. Elias froze, his eyes locked on the picture of his daughter. The world tilted on its axis. The safety he had sacrificed everything for, the humiliation, the janitor uniform, the silence. It was all an illusion. They had found her. "They know who you are, Elias," Evelyn said, her voice ruthless but necessary. "Al-Zarooni knows you survived. He's been tracking you for months. He knows you're at this base. He knows where Sarah goes to school. He attacked that convoy to force your hand. If you stay in this cell, those Marines die within the hour. And once he's done with them, do you think he's going to stop? He's coming for everything you have left." A low, feral growl started deep in Elias's chest. The janitor was dead. The man who scrubbed floors to pay for tuition was gone. In his place stood a father who had just realized his cub was being hunted by wolves. His hands curled into fists so tight his fingernails bit into his palms. The lethargy of the last decade evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. The only way to save Sarah was to end the threat that was coming for her. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the cell flickered and turned red. The base-wide alarm klaxon began to blare, a rhythmic, deafening pulse of sound that vibrated through the floor. Whoop, whoop. General quarters. Evelyn looked up at the light, then back at Elias. "Sterling has lost control," she said quickly. "The convoy is pinned down. He's hesitating. He's afraid to commit more assets because he doesn't want to admit he walked into a trap. Those boys have maybe 10 minutes before they're overrun." She reached into her pocket again and pulled out a small silver key. She held it out to him. "I can't order you to do this, Elias. You're a civilian. But I can open the door. The rest is up to you." Elias looked at the key, then at the photo of Sarah, then at the file of the man who killed his brothers. He didn't hesitate. He snatched the key from her hand and unlocked the cuffs in one fluid motion. The steel bracelets clattered to the floor. He rubbed his wrists, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "Get me a radio," Elias said, his voice like grinding stones. "And get me a weapon. We have a war to finish." The corridor leading back to the Tactical Operations Center was a flashing tunnel of crimson emergency lights, the walls pulsing like the interior of a dying artery. Elias didn't run. He moved with a fast, rolling, predatory gait that ate up the distance, his limp barely noticeable beneath the surge of adrenaline flooding his system. Beside him, Evelyn Weaver struggled to keep pace in her heels, barking orders into her secure phone, clearing a path through the confusion of the base lockdown. Junior officers and support staff flattened themselves against the walls as they passed, confused by the sight of the CIA handler flanking the base janitor as if he were a 4-star general. Elias wasn't looking at them. His mind was already projecting itself into the geography of the Arghandab Valley, calculating elevation, wind speed, and lines of sight. He ripped the Velcro name tag that read ELI off his chest and let it flutter to the floor. It was a symbolic shedding of the skin. The man who worried about wet floor signs was gone. In his place was the operator who had once held off a Taliban company with 3 magazines and a combat knife. He reached the heavy double doors of the war room, paused for a fraction of a second to center his breathing, and then kicked them open with enough force to rattle the hinges. The scene inside was a tableau of absolute catastrophic failure. The organized hum of the military machine had dissolved into shouting matches and paralyzed indecision. Colonel Sterling was standing by the main console, his face slick with sweat, screaming into a dead handset while 3 different captains tried to show him conflicting data on their tablets. On the massive main screen, the situation was a nightmare rendered in high definition. The convoy was a cluster of burning vehicles, and the thermal signatures of the surviving Marines were shrinking into a tight, desperate circle. They were being hunted. The noise in the room died instantly as the doors slammed open. Every head turned to see Elias standing there, his gray jumpsuit torn, his face smeared with grime, but his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold intelligence. Sterling looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief that quickly morphed back into defensive rage. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "I told you to lock him up! Who let this man out? Get him out of here before I shoot him myself!" He reached for his sidearm, his panic making him irrational, seeing Elias not as a savior, but as a witness to his incompetence. Elias ignored the gun. He ignored the MPs who hesitated at the door, confused by Evelyn's presence. He walked straight toward the main console, moving through the cluster of officers like an icebreaker moving through a frozen sea. "Sit down, Colonel," Elias said, his voice not loud, but carrying a frequency of command that hit everyone in the chest. "You've done enough damage for one day." Sterling spluttered, his face turning purple. "You are a janitor. You have no authority here." Elias didn't stop. He reached the console, grabbed the headset from the stunned communications officer, and jammed it onto his head. He looked Sterling dead in the eye, the 2 men separated by inches of air but miles of character. "I'm not a janitor today," Elias hissed, his voice low and lethal. "Today, I'm the only hope those boys have. Now, unless you know how to call in a broken arrow strike on a target you can't see, I suggest you get out of my chair." The sheer weight of Elias's presence, backed by the terrifying reality on the screen, broke Sterling's resolve. The colonel wavered, looked at the dying thermal signatures, and stepped back, defeated by the truth he couldn't deny. Elias keyed the mic, his hands flying across the tactical keyboard, overriding the jamming codes that had cut off the convoy. The static hissed in his ear, a white noise of chaos. "Bravo Actual, this is Ghost," he said, using a call sign that hadn't been heard on a secure channel in 10 years. "Do you copy? Over." There was a pause, filled only by the crackle of gunfire and the screams of men dying thousands of miles away. Then a voice broke through, young, terrified, and breathless. "Ghost? Command, who is this? We are taking effective fire from the high ground. We are combat ineffective. We need extract now." Elias closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the terrain. He knew exactly where the enemy was hiding. "Listen to me, Marine. You can't extract. They have the LZ zeroed. If you move, you die." The room behind him was silent, watching the janitor work. "You need to pop purple smoke at your 12 o'clock, distance 50 meters. Close danger. Do it now." The voice on the radio hesitated. 50 meters? That's suicide. If we call air support that close, we're dead." Elias leaned into the mic, his voice calm and anchoring. "Not if I guide it. Trust me, son. Pop the smoke, or you won't live to see the sunset." On the screen, a tiny plume of purple smoke appeared on the thermal feed, blooming like a bruise against the gray rock. Elias switched channels, patching directly into the AC-130 gunship, loitering in the adjacent sector, the asset he had told Sterling to call earlier. "Slayer 1-6, this is Ghost Actual on priority override code Zulu 9-4. Do you have eyes on the purple smoke?" The pilot's voice came back, confused but professional. Copy, Ghost. We see the smoke, but we have no authorization for this sector. Command has not cleared. Elias cut him off, his voice hard as steel. To hell with authorization. You have 25 American Marines about to be executed by a Tier 1 target. I am authorizing a 105mm howitzer strike. Danger close. Coordinates to follow. On my mark. He looked up at the screen. The red enemy signatures were swarming toward the purple smoke, thinking it was a screen for a retreat. They were walking right into the trap. Colonel Sterling stepped forward, trembling. "You can't do that," he whispered. "If you miss by 10 feet, you kill our own men. You'll be sent to Leavenworth for life." Elias didn't look at him. He watched the screen. He watched the red dots merge with the purple smoke. "Fire," he whispered. The impact of the 105mm howitzer round was felt before it was heard. A digital tremor that shook the camera feed on the main screen a split second before the audio caught up. On the thermal display, the center of the screen turned into a blinding wash of white-hot energy, obliterating the red enemy signatures and the purple smoke in a single catastrophic flash. The war room held its collective breath, the silence absolute, suspended in that terrifying limbo between life and death. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screen showed nothing but static and swirling gray dust. Colonel Sterling squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the confirmation of friendly fire, already mentally drafting the report that would blame the janitor for the massacre. But then, the dust began to settle. Through the digital haze, the heat signatures of the Marines re-emerged, one by one, glowing steady and strong. They were alive. The shell had landed exactly where Elias had predicted, vaporizing the enemy force just 50 meters from the American line without scratching a single Marine. A cheer erupted from the comm station. Raw, unfiltered relief. But Elias didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He kept his hand pressed to the headset, listening to the silence that followed the explosion, knowing that in warfare, silence is often a lie. "Target destroyed," the pilot of Slayer 16 reported, his voice trembling slightly with the adrenaline of the risk he had just taken. "Good effect on target. We are remaining on station." The war room erupted into activity, officers moving with renewed purpose, inspired by the impossible rescue they had just witnessed. But Elias remained frozen, his eyes narrowing as he watched the edges of the screen. The attack had been too easy. Al-Zarooni was a butcher, yes, but he was also a tactician who played chess with human lives. He wouldn't sacrifice 100 men just to kill a squad of Marines, unless the Marines were the bait. Elias felt a prickle of dread crawl up his neck, a sixth sense that had saved his life more times than he could count. He tapped the keyboard, widening the scan range of the satellite feed, looking for the second wave. "Don't celebrate yet," Elias barked into the room, cutting through the applause. "Scan the perimeter. Look for electronic signatures. He didn't bring them out into the open just to let them die." As if on cue, the speakers in the war room let out a high-pitched screech of feedback, causing everyone to cover their ears. The encryption on the secure channel dissolved, replaced by a voice that was smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar. "Beautifully done, Elias," the voice purred through the speakers, echoing off the steel walls like a ghost haunting the machinery. "I see you haven't lost your touch. The ghost of the valley still knows how to bite." The room went deathly still. Colonel Sterling looked around wildly, realizing the base's most secure communications network had been breached from the outside. Elias didn't look around. He stared at the audio waveform dancing on the screen, his face a mask of stone. It was him, Malik Al-Zarooni. The voice hadn't changed in 10 years. It still carried that arrogant, serpentine cadence that made Elias's blood run cold. "You look older, my friend," Al-Zarooni continued, as if he could see into the room. "But then again, scrubbing floors for the people who betrayed you will do that to a man. Did you think I wouldn't find you? Did you think you could bury the past under a pile of dirty laundry?" The mockery was precise, designed to humiliate, but Elias heard something else underneath the taunts. He heard the background noise on Al-Zarooni's transmission, It wasn't the wind of a mountain cave. It was the hum of an industrial generator, a generator that sounded exactly like the ones used on American forward operating bases. Elias leaned into the microphone, his voice low and steady, refusing to give the warlord the satisfaction of hearing fear. "You wasted a lot of men today, Malik. For nothing." Al-Zarooni laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Nothing? Oh, Elias, you always thought too small. The convoy was just to get you into that chair, to get you to override the security protocols so you could call in that airstrike. And when you opened the system to talk to the plane, you opened the back door for me." The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. It was a cyber trap. The attack on the convoy was a feint to force Elias to use his old override codes, codes that Al-Zarooni's hackers had been waiting to piggyback on. "We are in the system now, Elias," Al-Zarooni whispered. "We have the base schematics. We have the patrol schedules. And most importantly, I have the personnel file you tried so hard to delete." The screen on the main wall flickered and changed. The map of Afghanistan disappeared. In its place, a single, high-resolution photo appeared. It was Sarah, smiling in her graduation gown. The text below it read, "Target acquired. Location, Arlington, Virginia. Current status, unguarded." The roar that ripped from Elias's throat was primal, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that made the hairs on the arms of every soldier in the room stand up. He didn't scream a word. He just slammed his fist onto the console with enough force to crack the plastic casing. "If you touch her," Elias snarled, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise, "there is no hole deep enough on this earth that will save you. I will skin you alive." Al-Zarooni's voice turned cold. "Then come and stop me. I'm not in the mountains, Ghost. I'm closer than you think. The game has moved. Check your perimeter." The line went dead. The speakers clicked off. The photo of Sarah vanished, replaced by the tactical map, but the damage was done. The war room was silent, staring at the janitor who was now trembling with a rage that terrified them more than the enemy. Elias ripped the headset off his head and threw it onto the desk. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes wild. "He's not in Afghanistan," Elias said, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "He's here. He's in the country. That signal, the generator hum. He's operating from a sleeper cell on U.S. soil. He's going after Sarah to finish what he started 10 years ago." Elias grabbed the astonished lieutenant by the collar of his uniform, pulling him close. "You listen to me," he commanded, his authority absolute. "You keep those Marines alive. You extract them and you get them home. If one of them dies because you were slow, I will come back for you." He shoved the lieutenant back and turned to Colonel Sterling, who was cowering by the wall. "And you," Elias spat, looking at the man with total contempt. "Stay out of my way." He looked at Evelyn. "I need a chopper. I need an extraction team to Virginia. And I need my gear. My real gear." Evelyn nodded, already typing on her phone, mobilizing resources that didn't officially exist. "The chopper is spinning up on pad 4, she said. "I have a team moving to Sarah's location, but they are 20 minutes out. We have to move." Elias didn't wait. He turned and sprinted for the door, his limp forgotten, his body moving with the lethal grace of a predator who has just picked up the scent. The janitor had left the building. The ghost was hunting, and God help anyone who stood between a father and his daughter. The cargo hold of the C-17 Globemaster was a cavern of vibrating steel and cold, recycled air, hurtling through the stratosphere at 600 miles per hour. Elias sat on a nylon jumpsuit, the hum of the massive engines drowning out the world. But in his head, the silence was deafening. He was no longer wearing the stained gray jumpsuit of the camp janitor. That skin had been shed, left in a pile on the hangar floor back in Kandahar. He was now clad in black tactical gear that had no flag, no rank, and no name. Equipment pulled from a CIA black site cache that officially didn't exist. He tightened the straps of his plate carrier, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the ceramic armor against his chest. In his hands, he held his old Sig Sauer P226, the metal cool and heavy, a weapon that felt like an extension of his own limb. He racked the slide, the clack-clack sound sharp and final. Beside him, Evelyn Weaver watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. She had seen many men go to war, but she had never seen a transformation like this. The broken, limping man who scrubbed toilets was gone. The man sitting before her was a kinetic instrument of violence, his eyes void of anything resembling mercy. He wasn't thinking about the morality of what he was about to do. He was thinking about windage, exit routes, and the exact amount of pressure required to crush a human trachea. He was thinking about Sarah. The transport touched down at a private airfield in Northern Virginia, just as a torrential storm broke over the state, turning the sky a bruised purple and black. The rain hammered against the fuselage like shrapnel, washing away the dust of Afghanistan and replacing it with the slick, oily sheen of the American suburbs. Elias and Evelyn transitioned immediately into a waiting armored SUV, the tires screeching as they tore out of the hangar and onto the highway. The drive was a blur of wet asphalt and passing streetlights, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. Elias stared out the window at the manicured lawns, the glowing storefronts, and the oblivious civilians rushing home for dinner. It was a surreal nightmare. The contrast between the peace outside and the war raging inside the car was nauseating. He checked the GPS tracker on the tablet Evelyn handed him. The red dot representing Sarah's phone was stationary at the Arlington Public Library. But 3 other signals, unauthorized, encrypted signatures that Evelyn's team had tagged, were closing in on the library from different directions. They were a tightening noose. "They're 3 minutes out," Evelyn said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're 5 minutes away. Elias, we aren't going to make it before they make contact." Elias looked at the map, his brain processing the grid. "Drive over the median," he said calmly. "Take the sidewalk if you have to. I'm not losing her." Through the rain-streaked windshield, the Arlington Public Library appeared like a beacon of warmth in the gloom, its large glass windows glowing with golden light. But to Elias, the building looked like a fishbowl, a trap made of glass waiting to be shattered. He saw Sarah before she saw him. She was standing under the concrete awning near the entrance, clutching her backpack, looking at her phone with a frown. She looked so small, so fragile against the storm. Elias felt a spike of terror in his heart that was sharper than any bullet. Then he saw them. 2 black sedans, indistinguishable from the dozens of other cars on the road, pulled up to the curb simultaneously, boxing her in. The doors opened in perfect unison and 4 men stepped out. They weren't wearing military fatigues. They were dressed in generic hoodies and jeans, blending in. But Elias recognized the movement, the spacing, the way their hands hovered near their waists. They were professionals. One of them approached Sarah, smiling, holding up a badge that was undoubtedly fake. Sarah hesitated, stepping back, her instincts flaring. The man reached out to grab her arm. That was the moment the world slowed down. Elias didn't wait for the car to stop. "Hit the high beams!" he shouted to Evelyn. As she flooded the street with blinding light, Elias kicked his door open and rolled out of the moving vehicle at 30 miles per hour. Elias hit the wet pavement, the impact jarring his bad leg, but he rolled through the pain, coming up in a crouch with his weapon drawn. The transition from motion to stillness was instantaneous. The sound of the SUV skidding to a halt drew the attention of the attackers for a split second, a fatal mistake. Elias fired. Crack, crack. The first 2 shots were surgical, hitting the man reaching for Sarah in the shoulder and thigh, dropping him instantly without killing him. He needed someone left alive to question. The other 3 men spun around, reaching for suppressed submachine guns hidden under their coats. The quiet suburban street erupted into a war zone. Glass shattered as stray rounds took out the library windows. Screams pierced the air. Elias moved like a wraith, using the parked cars as cover, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He didn't shout warnings. He didn't offer surrender. He was a force of nature. He flanked the second attacker, slamming the butt of his pistol into the man's temple with a sickening crunch, sending him sprawling into the gutter. The third man opened fire, bullets sparking off the pavement inches from Elias's face. But Elias didn't flinch. He dove forward, sliding across the wet hood of a Honda, and fired 3 rounds into the attacker's engine block and tires, immobilizing their escape vehicle. Sarah screamed, dropping her backpack and pressing herself against the brick wall of the library, covering her ears. She watched in horror as the janitor she knew, her quiet, limping father, dismantled a squad of trained killers with the efficiency of a machine. Elias reached the steps, breathing hard, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He stood over the last conscious attacker, his gun trained on the man's center mass, then turned to look at his daughter. The look on her face broke him. It wasn't relief. It was terror. She didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the rain. "Dad, what did you do? Who are you?" Elias lowered his weapon slightly, reaching out a hand that was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. "I'm sorry, baby," he choked out, the emotion cracking his voice. "I'm so sorry." But before he could hug her, before he could explain the lies and the love that hid them, a red laser dot appeared on the center of Sarah's forehead. Elias's pupils dilated. He didn't think. He tackled her, slamming her onto the wet concrete just as a high-caliber round disintegrated the brick wall exactly where her head had been. They weren't safe. The hit squad was just the distraction. The real threat was a sniper watching from the shadows. The pavement behind the library wall disintegrated into a cloud of pulverized brick and concrete dust as the high-velocity rounds chewed through the cover, searching for flesh. Elias pressed his body over Sarah's, using his own armored back as a human shield against the sniper fire raining down from the adjacent parking structure. The sound was terrifying, a rhythmic, thunderous cracking that echoed off the wet asphalt, distinct from the chaotic spray of the earlier gunfight. Sarah was sobbing into his chest, her hands clutching the wet fabric of his tactical vest, her entire world fracturing in real time. She smelled the cordite, the sweat, and the metallic tang of blood on his sleeve, scents that didn't belong to the father who cleaned spills in the school cafeteria. Elias didn't offer comfort. There was no time. He was operating on pure instinct, counting the seconds between shots. Crack. 1, 2, 3. Crack. It was a semi-automatic rifle, likely a Dragunov, and the shooter was adjusting his angle. "We have to move!" Elias roared over the storm, gripping Sarah's arm with a force that would leave bruises. "When I say go, you run to the alley. You don't look back. You don't stop. Do you understand me?" Sarah looked up, her eyes wide and uncomprehending, seeing a stranger's eyes in her father's face. "Go!" Elias screamed, shoving her forward as he spun out from cover, firing 3 suppression shots blindly toward the sniper's nest to buy her a fraction of a second. They scrambled into the darkness of the alleyway, slipping on wet trash and oil, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The sniper fire ceased, losing the angle, but the silence that followed was even more menacing. Elias didn't slow down. He dragged Sarah toward a rusted chain-link fence, lifted her over it as if she weighed nothing, and vaulted it himself, landing on his bad leg with a grimace he hid in the shadows. Evelyn's SUV screeched around the corner, the passenger door already flying open. The vehicle was a wreck. The windshield was spider-webbed, and the side panels were riddled with bullet holes, but the engine was roaring. They dove into the back seat, and before the door was even closed, Evelyn punched the accelerator, sending the heavy vehicle fishtailing onto the main road. For 10 minutes, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the frantic slapping of the windshield wipers and Sarah's hyperventilating breath. Elias sat apart from her, checking his magazine, his hands shaking slightly now that the immediate threat was gone. He looked at his daughter, seeing the way she pressed herself against the door as far away from him as possible. He realized with a sinking heart that he had saved her life, but he might have lost her trust forever. They abandoned the battered SUV under a bridge and switched to a clean car Evelyn had stashed nearby, a nondescript sedan that smelled of stale cigarettes. They drove in silence to a safe house in a decaying industrial district, a place of flickering neon signs and shadowed doorways. Inside, the room was sparse, a single mattress, a table, and blackout curtains taped over the windows. As soon as the door clicked shut, the dam broke. Sarah spun around, pushing Elias away when he tried to check her for injuries. "Don't touch me!" she screamed, her voice raw and hysterical. "Who are you? You killed those men. You moved like a machine. My dad has a bad back. My dad cleans floors. Who are you?" She was backing away, looking at him like he was a monster. Elias stood still, his hands raised in surrender, the tactical gear looking absurdly out of place in the domestic argument. He looked at Evelyn, who stood by the door, guarding them. She gave a small, sad nod. It was time. Elias reached up and slowly unbuckled his tactical vest, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud. He peeled off the black shirt, standing bare-chested under the harsh yellow light of the motel room, exposing the map of scars that covered his torso, bullet wounds, knife slashes, and burn marks that he had hidden under baggy jumpsuits for a decade. "I am your father, Sarah. That is the only truth that matters," Elias said, his voice quiet and broken. He walked slowly to the bed and sat down, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. "But the man you knew, the janitor, he was a costume. I put him on every morning to keep you safe." He gestured to the tattoo on his arm, the one Colonel Sterling had mocked, the one that had started this entire nightmare. 10 years ago, I commanded a unit that didn't exist. We did the things no one else wanted to do. And when it went wrong, when bad men came after us, I had to make a choice. I could keep being a soldier, or I could be your dad. I couldn't be both. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I chose you. I chose to be boring. I chose to be invisible. I let people humiliate me. I let them laugh at me. Because every day I scrubbed a floor was a day you went to school safely. I wanted you to have a life where you never saw a gun, where you never knew what blood smelled like." Tears streamed down his face, cutting through the grime of the battle. "I'm sorry I failed. I'm sorry the war followed me home. But I will burn the entire world down before I let them hurt you." Sarah stared at him, the anger slowly draining out of her, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking realization. She looked at the scars, the physical evidence of the pain he had endured silently. She thought about the limp he never complained about, the way he sat facing the door in restaurants, the nights he woke up sweating. It all made sense now. The boring dad wasn't weak. He was the strongest man she had ever known, holding back a tidal wave of violence just to braid her hair and make her breakfast. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, until she was standing in front of him. She reached out and touched the jagged scar on his shoulder, her fingers trembling. "Is it over?" she whispered, looking into his eyes. Elias covered her hand with his own, his grip gentle. He looked at Evelyn, who was checking her phone with a grim expression. The news wasn't good. Al-Zarooni hadn't just sent a hit squad. He had leaked Elias's identity to every terror cell in the hemisphere. The safe house wouldn't stay safe for long. Elias stood up, his demeanor shifting from father back to warrior. "No," he said, his voice hardening into steel. "It's not over. We can't run anymore, Sarah. Running just gives them a target. Tonight we stop hiding. Tonight we go to the source." He turned to Evelyn. "Where is he?" The location Evelyn had tracked the signal to was a decommissioned shipping yard on the industrial fringe of Baltimore, a graveyard of rusted iron giants looming out of the mist like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. The rain had turned into a deluge, hammering against the corrugated metal roofs with a sound like thousands of ball bearings being poured onto a tin sheet. Elias moved through this metallic labyrinth, not as a man, but as a void in the darkness. He had left Sarah with Evelyn in the car 2 miles back, ignoring his daughter's tearful pleas to stay. This part of the work was not for her eyes. It was a surgical excision of a cancer that had threatened his world. He slipped between 2 stacked shipping containers, his boots making no sound on the oil-slicked concrete. His bad leg burned with a white-hot agony, the damp cold settling into the old shrapnel wounds. But he fed that pain into the furnace of his rage. He eliminated the outer perimeter guards with terrifying efficiency. A knife in the dark, a snapped neck, a body dragged into the shadows. There were no gunshots, no alarms, just the silence of men disappearing one by one. Elias was methodically dismantling Al-Zarooni's security net, stripping the warlord of his protection until only the two of them remained. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a father protecting his cub, and that made him infinitely more dangerous than any political assassin. Inside the main warehouse, the atmosphere shifted from the cold wet of the storm to the humid, electric buzz of high-tech warfare. The vast space had been converted into a mobile command center, filled with server racks, satellite uplinks, and weapons crates. In the center of the room, bathed in the blue glow of monitors, sat Malik Al-Zarooni. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, cleaning a curved Damascus steel dagger with a silk cloth, looking every bit the king in exile. The remaining 6 mercenaries of his elite guard stood in a semicircle around him, weapons raised, scanning the shadows of the rafters. They were nervous. They had lost contact with the outer perimeter 5 minutes ago, and the silence was eating at their discipline. "Come out, Elias," Al-Zarooni called out, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "Stop scurrying in the walls like a rat. You want to finish this?" "Here I am." Elias didn't respond with words. He responded by shooting out the main breaker box on the far wall with a single suppressed round. The warehouse plunged into absolute darkness. Chaos erupted. The mercenaries opened fire blindly, their muzzle flashes strobing like lightning, illuminating brief, terrifying glimpses of Elias dropping from the gantry crane like a phantom. The next 30 seconds were a masterclass in close-quarters violence. Elias hit the floor rolling, coming up inside the guards' defensive circle before they could adjust their night vision. He used the confusion as a weapon, turning their panic against them. He disarmed the nearest mercenary, using the man's body as a shield against the spray of automatic fire from his partner. It was brutal, intimate work. The sound of breaking bone, the wet thud of knives finding soft tissue, the gurgle of dying men. Elias moved with a fluidity that defied his age and his injuries, driven by a singular, blinding purpose. He took a graze to his left shoulder, the bullet tearing through the Kevlar, but he didn't slow down. He swept the legs of the last guard, crushing his windpipe with a heavy boot before the man hit the ground. When the emergency generator finally kicked in, bathing the room in a harsh, flickering red emergency light, only 2 men were left standing. Elias stood amidst the carnage of the elite guard, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his fingertips. Across the room, Al-Zarooni stood up slowly, discarding the silk cloth. He didn't look afraid. He looked delighted. "Finally," the warlord smiled, tossing the dagger from hand to hand. "The janitor is dead. The warrior has returned." "I'm not a warrior," Elias rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion and pain. He dropped his empty pistol and drew his own combat knife, a simple, rusted blade he had carried since his first tour. "I'm a father, and you made a mistake, Malik. You thought threatening my family would make me weak. You thought I would surrender to save them." Elias stepped forward, limping heavily now, the adrenaline beginning to fade and leave room for the agony of his torn muscles. "But you just removed the only thing holding me back. I don't have rules of engagement anymore. I don't have a flag. I just have you." Al-Zarooni laughed, a sound that lacked his earlier confidence. He lunged, the Damascus blade flashing in the red light. The fight that followed was ugly and desperate. It wasn't a choreographed movie duel. It was 2 wolves tearing at each other in a pit. Al-Zarooni was faster, younger, and uninjured. He slashed Elias across the chest, opening a new wound over old scars. He kicked Elias's bad knee, sending him crumbling to the concrete with a cry of pain. Al-Zarooni loomed over him, raising the blade for the killing stroke. "Look at you," he sneered, kneeling again, "just like you did for those officers. You were born to serve, Elias, and now you will die on your knees." But Elias didn't look at the blade. He looked at Al-Zarooni's eyes. The warlord had made the fatal error of arrogance. He assumed the man on the floor was beaten. He didn't know that for 10 years, Elias's job was to be invisible, to be lowly, to be ignored until it was too late. Elias grabbed a handful of the industrial grit and metal filings from the warehouse floor, the dirt he had spent a decade cleaning up, and threw it directly into Al-Zarooni's eyes. The warlord screamed, blinded, slashing wildly at the air. It was a dirty move, a street move, a janitor's move. Elias didn't waste the opening. He roared, driving his body upward, tackling Al-Zarooni into the server racks. Sparks showered down around them as they crashed through the electronics. Elias didn't use finesse. He used brute force, slamming Al-Zarooni's head against the steel frame once, twice, 3 times, until the resistance stopped. They fell to the floor together, a tangle of limbs and blood. Elias lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his hand gripping the collar of the man who had haunted his life for a decade. Al-Zarooni stared up at the ceiling, his eyes glassy, the threat finally extinguished. Elias rolled off him, lying on his back in the ruins of the command center. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't menacing. It was the silence of the end. He reached for his radio, his fingers slick with blood. "Evelyn," he whispered, "it's done. Sarah is safe." The aftermath of the raid on the Baltimore shipyard was a surreal collage of flashing red and blue lights, reflecting off the wet pavement, creating a kaleidoscope of chaos against the black sky. Federal agents swarmed the facility like ants, tagging evidence, dismantling the server farm, and zipping body bags. Elias sat on the rear bumper of an ambulance, a thermal blanket draped over his shoulders, a paramedic stitching the laceration on his chest. He didn't feel the needle. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that felt heavier than any armor. He looked at his hands, stained with grease and dried blood. For 10 years, these hands had held a mop to hide their lethality. Tonight, they had done what they were built to do, but there was no triumph in it, only relief. Evelyn Weaver stood nearby, arguing with a frantic FBI section chief, flashing her credentials and ensuring that Elias's name would never appear in a police report. She was scrubbing the record, just as Elias had scrubbed floors, ensuring that the janitor remained a myth and the operator remained a ghost. The war was over. The network was dismantled. Al-Zarooni was gone. But as Elias looked up and saw Sarah walking toward him through the rain, pushing past the police line, he realized the real battle, the battle for his daughter's heart, was just beginning. Sarah didn't run to him this time. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the bandages, the bruises, and the weary slump of his shoulders. She stopped a foot away, looking down at the man she thought she knew. The silence between them was thick, filled with a decade of lies and the terrifying truth of the last 6 hours. "You're hurt," she said softly, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, fierce maturity. Elias tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "It's just a scratch, kiddo. I've had worse." He waited for the accusation, for the anger she had shown in the safe house. Instead, Sarah reached out and pulled the thermal blanket tighter around him. "I used to be ashamed," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "When you picked me up from school in your work clothes, when the other kids laughed at your limp, I was ashamed. I thought you were weak." She choked on a sob, shaking her head. "I didn't know you were limping because you carried the world for me." Elias felt his throat tighten. He reached out and pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair. He didn't say anything. There were no words left. He just held her, the warrior finally allowing himself to be the father, the two of them anchored together in the swirling chaos of the crime scene. 3 days later, the reckoning arrived at Camp Ironhold. It didn't come with a bang, but with the terrifying quiet of administrative justice. Colonel Sterling stood at attention in his own office, his face pale and sweating. Across from him sat not a general, but Admiral Holloway, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who had flown in personally after reviewing the mission logs and the unauthorized airstrike data. Evelyn Weaver stood in the corner, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "You ignored intelligence," the Admiral said, his voice low and dangerous. "You walked a platoon of Marines into a known kill box to pad your promotion file, and when a civilian contractor, a man with 3 Navy crosses and a service record that makes yours look like a comic book, tried to save them, you threw him in a cell." Sterling tried to speak, to bluster. "Sir, he was a janitor. He assaulted an officer." The Admiral slammed his hand on the desk. "That janitor is the reason 25 Marines are eating dinner with their families tonight instead of coming home in draped boxes. You are relieved of command, Colonel. Effective immediately. You will be escorted off this base, and you will face a court-martial for gross negligence." As the MPs stripped the rank insignia from Sterling's shoulders, the humiliation was absolute. The arrogant tyrant who had laughed at a cheap suit was destroyed by the truth he had refused to see. Elias wasn't there to see Sterling's fall. He was sitting on the porch of his small, rented bungalow in Virginia, watching the sun come up over the quiet suburban street. He wore jeans and a clean flannel shirt. No jumpsuit, no tactical gear. A black government sedan pulled up to the curb. Admiral Holloway stepped out, followed by Evelyn. The Admiral walked up the driveway, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a salute. Slow, crisp, and respectful. Elias didn't stand. He just nodded, sipping his coffee. "We cleared your record, Master Chief," the Admiral said. "Full reinstatement of pension, back pay for 10 years, and there's a spot for you at the Pentagon. Intelligence analyst. Name your price. We need minds like yours." It was the offer of a lifetime. Redemption. Status. Power. Elias looked at the Admiral, then he looked through the front window of the house. Inside, Sarah was asleep on the couch, safe, dreaming of a future that didn't involve hiding. Elias turned back to the Admiral. "Thank you, sir," Elias said quietly. "But I already have a job. I'm a father, and I have a lot of lost time to make up for." He declined the glory. He declined the war. He chose the peace he had fought so hard to earn. The final scene took place 2 months later, under the bright golden sun of a football stadium. It was high school graduation day. The stands were packed with cheering families, balloons, and noise. Elias sat in the bleachers, wearing a suit. It wasn't a cheap suit this time. It was tailored, sharp, and dignified. He sat with a straight back, his limp barely protecting him from standing tall. When the announcer called, "Sarah Thorne," the crowd clapped politely, but Elias stood up and cheered louder than anyone, clapping until his hands stung. Sarah walked across the stage, grabbed her diploma, and looked up into the stands. She didn't look for the exit. She didn't look for her friends. She scanned the crowd until she found him. She smiled, a radiant, unburdened smile, and raised her diploma in the air, pointing it directly at him. It was a salute, not a military one, but something deeper. Acknowledgement. Elias smiled back, tears stinging his eyes behind his sunglasses. The janitor was gone. The ghost was retired. The man in the stands was just a dad, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. He sat back down, watching the caps fly into the air, finally at peace with the silence.